One last thing. The biggest scam they have, the biggest con, is not just the appropriations process and how they fund it. It's the Federal Reserve. Okay? Okay? 0.5% of the citizens of this country own more assets than the bottom 90%. That's all happened over the last 10 years since 2008. We took a monetary base of what, back in the 80s of what, $800 billion? The balance sheet of the Fed was $880 billion under President Bush, right? Balance sheet of the Fed is $9.5 trillion today. The debt's $30 trillion. We have $100 to $150 trillion of contingent liabilities, all just because we're the prime reserve currency. The greatest export we have is the dollar. But all of that rests on the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren. Those are all due bills that are come due. All we've done is we've just cranked everything up. That's why they're talking about these ridiculous, insane bills of trillions of dollars, because the Federal Reserve will print the money. The Federal Reserve, by the way, that's owned not by the American people, a central bank that's owned by 24 prime brokers, being J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Now, how does that work? And governors that kind of selected, but, 12 years. And the best governor we've had in the Federal Reserve right here in Dallas, Richard Fisher, who told you what was going to happen by going to negative interest rates, told you what was going to happen by printing all this money and having $4, $5, $6 trillion, $7 trillion, $8 trillion, now $9 trillion on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. It's going to cause, you talk inequality, it's not a $15 minimum wage, that's tip money. We have, I think M2 today is what, $22 or $23 trillion. That's how the administrative state pays for itself. We don't need to audit the Fed. We need to end the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has usurped its power and the power of the American people and our elected representatives. And no, they do not have the consent of the governed. We will not comply. We will not submit, and it must be ended. In closing, let me just remind you, from the founding of this nation up to the founding of the Federal Reserve, for those 100 years, Hamilton versus Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, Teddy Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, the whole concept of 19th century is almost entirely the politics of money. It was actively debated what the currency was. Who controlled the currency? What was a central bank? Who controlled the central bank? After the Federal Reserve was formed, we've lost that. That is going to be one of the, if not the most major issue we have. We have to end the Federal Reserve. We have to turn it back. That central bank is going to be owned by one group. You know what that group is? The American people. The American people. Not a bunch of fat cat prime brokers on Wall Street. Not guys like, not third-tier bankers from fifth-tier firms like Powell. You're going to have the American people control their own bank and their own currency.